Hello and welcome back to Photoshop CS6 for web designers. In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of creating a new document in Photoshop, and this new document is the document we're going to start with as we start to build out this web design. Now, when you're working in Photoshop, there's one very important thing to keep in mind, and that's that you might not be the only person to ever touch this Photoshop document. Especially if you're working in a creative house or on the creative team for a large company, you probably won't be the only person to make changes to this document. So you need to keep some things in mind as you're working in Photoshop. One of the most important things that you'll hear me talk about a few times is naming your layers and grouping your layers appropriately. This particular file is made up of dozens of layers, but as you can see over in our layers panel, I've kept these layers this layer stack anyways pretty clean. We have a few different folders that contain all of the layers for different sections of our site so that we don't have just an ongoing stack of layers that are impossible to sort through. Also, each of the layers and layer groups are all named, which makes it a lot easier to navigate through your document. And one of the great new features of Photoshop CS6 is that you can now search by layer name in order to find the layer that you're looking for. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But even if you work by yourself in your home for remote clients, you still need to keep these things in mind, because even though you may work alone, there's always a chance that someone somewhere is going to need that Photoshop file. And if the file's not clean, they're going to have a tough time sorting through it and figuring out what goes where. So on top of having your layers arranged in a neat fashion and easy to understand fashion, it's important to also keep in mind your folder structure or the file structure for all of the files that you're using in relation to your Photoshop document. In other words, if you're using a custom font that not everybody would have on their system, let's say you found a fancy font online that you're using for the logo of your document, it's important to take that font file and include it with your Photoshop file. Put it in a subdirectory in the same area as your Photoshop file so that whoever's using that Photoshop file can have easy access to those fonts and they'll be able to view it and edit it appropriately on their system. Same goes with any images you might be using. For example, we have about 7 or 8 different images that we're using in this particular file, and it's important to include those images, the original versions of those images, in your folder structure as well, so that if somebody needs to go back and change the original image itself before it's pulled into Photoshop, they can do that. So with those things in mind, let's create our first Photoshop document. So we can do this one of two ways. We can either go to the File menu and click on New, or if you're using a Mac, you can hit Command N on your keyboard, or on a PC, Control N, and that will create a new Photoshop document. So here we can give our document a name. You can either do this now or later on when you save the file. I find it easier to go ahead and do it right away. So we'll call it Freds_photos. And then there are a number of presets you can use. I'm not going to worry about the presets. One of the presets is actually a web preset, but that sets it to 800 by 600. Nobody designs at 800 by 600 anymore because most people have larger screens unless they're viewing your website on their mobile device. And then of course the size issues will be different, but that's a little beyond the scope of this particular series. So instead of using web, I'm going to go back down to custom. And for width, I want the width of our content to be 960 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and enter 960 here. Later on, we're actually going to change that, but I want to show you a trick, which we'll get into in a future video. We're going to start off with 960 pixels, and later we'll make this wider, and I'll explain why at another point in time. But I'm going to set the height to maybe around 1000 pixels, and again, the height is going to change as well, depending on how much content is on your page. But later on, we'll talk about how we can adjust the height of our document if things aren't working out as we want. Also, make sure that you have pixels selected over here from the dropdown and not inches or centimeters. We're not dealing with print documents. This isn't something we're going to print out on paper. So we don't need to worry about inches, centimeters, millimeters, whatever it is. We are only dealing with pixels here. Also, since we're designing for the screen and not for print, we're going to keep our resolution at 72 pixels per inch. If you're designing for print or something like that, you would use a higher resolution like 200 ppi or 300 ppi. But when you're dealing with designing for the web, you want to keep your resolution pretty small. Keep it down to 72 pixels per inch. Also, make sure that you're using the RGB color mode. All display screens use RGB, not CMYK. So we're going to leave that at RGB color 8-bit. And then one last thing I want to point out here, under the Advanced tab, if you don't see these advanced options here, you might just see that. Then we'll just click on that drop down arrow, and now we can see the advanced options. I'm just going to turn off color management. I'm going to say don't color manage this document. I don't want Photoshop to color manage this document because, again, we're not doing this for print. We're doing this for display on the screen, and any kind of color management is really going to have the potential of messing up the way our images look in our website. So let's turn off color management, and then once we're done with all of those settings, we'll click on OK. So now you've officially created your first Photoshop document. Obviously, it's not that exciting just yet, but in the next video, we'll get started setting up this document so that we can start adding some graphics to it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.